What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you were younger? What can you see so clearly now that you were unable to see back then? I love hearing the advice that people would give to their younger selves. I was Googling this, and here were a few things that celebrities said that they wish they could tell their younger selves. Be grateful. Enjoy what you have while you can. Don't be afraid. Don't stress about the outcome of things. Relax. Don't take yourself so seriously. You're not the only one. Everyone's going through something. I wonder if any of those resonate with you. I wonder what you might add to the list. I remember chatting to someone close to me, and I asked them, do you ever wish you could go back and be a teenager again? No way, they said, unless I could go back with what I know now. Yeah, then I'd go back. If you could go back to a particular time in your life, how would you handle things differently? If you had the knowledge, the information, the data that you do now. And I think all of these reflections, they relate to some remarkable words from the cross in Luke's Gospel. Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." How might those crucifying Jesus have done things differently if they had known exactly what they were doing, if they had known who it was they were crucifying? And we're going to hear these words, "Father, forgive them," in context now. And then what we'll do is we'll examine them a bit more closely and look at implications, how they might be good news for our relationships with God, with ourselves, and with one another. So I'm going to invite Joyce up now to read.
This is the one. Yeah. Right, the reading this morning is from Luke 23, 33 to 43. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine and vinegar and said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there and hurled insults at him, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said. "Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Amen.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
Those words, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," are words that I keep coming back to in my preaching. I find them compelling. I find myself quoting them in all sorts of different sermons on all different themes. And I have to ask myself, why am I so attracted to these words? I think there's something about them that summarises or typifies Jesus' character and identity. Jesus doesn't just teach enemy love, he actually lives it, speaks it, puts it into practice, and he does so even under the crushing pressure of his near and imminent death. These words, like enemy love, are, metaphorically speaking, flowers growing up through concrete. Because a good man might be able to pray for the forgiveness of one's enemies after one has been wronged and once the pain has been processed appropriately. But only a God man can pray for forgiveness and acquittal of his enemies while they are still killing him. I can see now why many theologians have said that we see Christ's divinity most clearly in his human suffering, his humanity, and not necessarily in his miraculous deeds and godlike acts. I felt a bit sad when I first read in commentaries that these particular words from the cross are not in the very, very, very earliest manuscripts we have of Luke's Gospel. I started thinking, so did Jesus really say them? Why were they added later? But having had time to reflect on this, I wonder, is this necessarily a problem? Perhaps when Luke's Gospel was read out in Christian communities, people would add their memories or inherited memories of the crucifixion. This might have been second generation, third generation, fourth generation Christians. And they might have said something like, as Luke's Gospel was being read out, they might have said, oh, it's a good account. Well done, Luke. But don't forget that he also said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. And perhaps over time, this oral tradition and textual tradition combined, and those words eventually became part of the text itself. But however these words found their way into Luke's account of the crucifixion, it seems clear to me that they are thoroughly consistent with how Luke depicts Jesus and the early church's attitude to those who crucified him. They're a perfect fit, because in Luke's Gospel, Jesus preached enemy love and radical forgiveness. It was what he was all about. And in Luke's second book, the book of Acts, we find the Apostle Peter preaching to his fellow Israelites. And he said this, "You killed the author of life." What condemning words. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. But then Peter softens the message and says, I know you acted in ignorance, as did your leaders. So again, we see this theme of ignorance, just like in Jesus' words from the cross. So where did Peter's generous attitude regarding the ignorance of Jesus' opponents come from, if not from Jesus himself? I'm convinced it comes from Jesus. Perhaps Jesus' words from the cross that we're looking at this morning. Another controversy in the commentaries is regarding who exactly Jesus is talking about when he prays, Father, forgive them for they do not know what they're doing. Is he praying solely for the Roman soldiers executing him? Or is he also praying for Pilate and Herod, for the crowd that called for his execution, for Judas who betrayed him, for the chief priests and teachers of the law that paid Judas to betray him? Perhaps even further, what about those criminals on either side of Jesus? What about us? Was he praying for us too? I picture a series of concentric circles with the cross in the middle, and they're getting wider and wider. Are we not all wholly or partially ignorant of the impact of our actions and words? Don't we all have a need for God's mercy and forgiveness? I love this idea that from the cross, Jesus prayed that compassionate prayer, not only for those who betrayed him and killed him, but also for each one of us. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. When we think about the things we regret, those ways that we've done damage in the past, why don't we talk more about ignorance? The fact that we knew not what we did. Perhaps we knew in part, but we didn't have the whole picture. None of us did. None of us do. That's why we can give advice. We can think of advice that we might give our younger selves. We did not know fully what we were doing. There were things that clouded our judgments, our vision, things that came up, strong emotions perhaps, impulses, anger, fear, hunger, what we looked at in the all-age talk. And all of this is not to say that we're not responsible for our actions. Ignorance of the law excuses not. You might have heard that. That's a legal principle that arguably has its origin in the biblical book of Leviticus. I can accept responsibility for my actions and at the same time acknowledge that I was partially ignorant, at least partially ignorant. And by doing so, I can have compassion for my past self while remaining responsible for my behaviour, both past and present. It's a tension. But I wonder if we don't have enough compassion for our past selves. What do you think? I don't think we have enough. Do you ever find yourself looking down on who you once were and what you once believed and what you once thought was acceptable? Do you cringe when you think back to some error of judgment you made? Do you beat yourself up for not getting to where you're at now sooner? People say things like, why didn't I quit alcohol when it first started messing with my mental health and relationships? Why didn't I leave that toxic faith community when the alarm bells first started ringing? Why didn't I speak up for marginalised groups earlier? Why was I so slow to understand my responsibility for caring for creation? How could I have burnt bridges with those friends and family? How could I let that person turn me into a shadow of who I once was? Why did I have no boundaries? How could I break that person's heart like that? How could I do that? How could I not do the right thing? And we could go on. There are lots of examples of this. I'm interested in something, a dynamic. Often a lack of compassion for our past self can hinder self-love and one's journey of self-forgiveness in the present. But I think the issue is actually bigger than that, even bigger than that. When we lack compassion for who we used to be, it can lead to pride, arrogance, even a hatred for people who remind us of who we used to be or where we've come from. And that is a really big problem, a really, really big problem. But I see good news in Jesus' words from the cross, because if Jesus showed compassion during his crucifixion for those who did not know what they were doing, surely we can show some compassion for ourselves. If Jesus was able to accept that a kind of ignorance clouded the vision of his executors and betrayers, surely we will need to accept that our vision has been clouded too. There are things that we would have done, and there are things that we would have done differently if we'd seen the bigger picture. But we didn't have that bigger picture, or we didn't know how to, we didn't have the tools to interpret it well. I think Jesus' words invite us to have compassion for ourselves, for who we were, what we said, what we did, what we thought. Jesus asks God to forgive. Jesus' request as God's Son is an assurance of God's readiness to forgive. Let's receive that forgiveness. We can receive that forgiveness this morning afresh. And in turn, forgive ourselves. And perhaps then, we might even be able to forgive others and recognise that those who hurt us were limited in their knowledge too. They suffered from that same partial ignorance, that clouded vision. They too are recipients of God's compassion and forgiveness. And yet, like us, they do not cease to be responsible for their actions, past and present. There's this tension. So a key question for us all. A key question for us all when we encounter the compassion from the cross is, what will we do next? Where do we go from here? Will we try to go back to those mistakes we made before, repeat history, or will we go forward with Jesus? I think this seems to be the difference between the two criminals at each side of Jesus. For them, the cross, it was also a crossroads. The first criminal is interested in so far as Jesus might enable him to come down from the cross, to go back to what he knew. He taunts Jesus, tries to provoke Jesus to use his power to help them escape. He says, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the second criminal, a bit different. The second criminal is convinced that, unlike them, Jesus is innocent, dying on behalf of others, and that his best hope is to entrust his future into Jesus' hands. He says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And of course, Jesus surely has compassion on both men. Neither knew fully what they were doing when they committed their crimes. But the first wants to go back to his old life, whereas the second wants to go forward with Jesus into a new life, an eternal life. And surely God's forgiveness is big enough to encompass both men. Jesus no doubt prayed for both when he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." But the second criminal made a specific request. And Jesus encourages that one by saying, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So, how can we summarise this scene, this crucifixion scene? How about this? Jesus' compassionate prayer points to the readiness of God to forgive. But this does not erase our responsibility for our actions, past or present. And so the cross is also a crossroads, a place where we must decide if we want to go back to our old life or go forward with Jesus. And in this scene, divine compassion and human transformation go hand in hand. Jesus' compassion for all of us who do not know fully what we're doing is surely not an invitation to remain where we are. I wonder if it's actually an invitation to keep moving, for us to change as we discover new things about God, about life, about ourselves. And I find this exciting, that a journey of faith can be a constant adventure of new revelations and realizations. Does that sound like your faith journey? A constant adventure of new revelations and new realizations. Have you changed at all? Have you transformed? Has there been any transformation? And yet, we can't force it. It's the really difficult thing. We can't strive, we can't use our effort, we can't force the transformation. I've shared this quote before, but it's so powerful. Carl Rogers, who pioneered person-centered psychotherapy, observed a certain paradox in himself. The curious paradox is, he says, is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. I'll read that again. Carl Rogers. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. We do not change by rejecting ourselves or imagining God rejects us. We do not change through a tightening of the muscles, but through a relaxation of the inner life. And I think Jesus' words from the cross give us a way in to that relaxation and acceptance. If Jesus had compassion on us in our state of limited knowledge, then we can have compassion on ourselves and on other limited people. This allows us to be quicker to forgive, to be more accepting, and in turn this promotes a kind of atmosphere, a lighter atmosphere, where we and others can own up to where we've got it wrong and take responsibility for our actions, make changes, and become even more who we were created to be. But there's a great challenge in the midst of this. Will we maintain compassion for our previous self as we change? Will you continue as well? Will you continue to have compassion for those who remind you of your previous self, knowing that they too are beloved recipients of divine compassion and forgiveness? As I invite Steph and Emily back, let's turn to the communion table now, because that's where we're heading. And as we turn to it, we might consider that Jesus was thinking too of Judas when he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And Judas too was invited to participate in that Last Supper. He too shared the bread and the wine. He too, a recipient of God's grace and forgiveness. So how can we stop anyone from coming to the table? All of us come as recipients of the compassion from the cross. Amen. So we're going to sing as we come to the table, "This is our God."